It's been turbocharged by, in microeconomics, by a factor of 1,000. The ease of imitation. Creation hasn't gotten any easier, but the ease of theft has gone up dramatically. So in this world we're in, and where America's competitive advantage is in innovation, we really have to pay attention to the value capture side of it, or we've got nothing left.
Hello, I'm Bruce Berman, the host of Understanding IP Matters, a podcast series that looks at how IP rights enable creators and businesses to achieve and how they impact lives. Listeners who followed Season 1, thank you. Remember that all Understanding IP Matters episodes are available wherever you stream podcasts. We encourage your comments and welcome suggestions for topics and guests. Please contact us at explore@understandingip.org. David Teese is both a scholar and an entrepreneur. A highly regarded economist, he has founded and managed businesses, owns commercial real estate, including a farm and vineyards in his native New Zealand. Teese is executive chairman and co-founder of Berkeley Research Group, an expert services and consulting firm with more than 1,000 employees. He is also professor of global business and director of the Tusher Center for the Management of Intellectual Capital at UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business. Teese is one of the most recognized economic scholars, having been cited more than 120,000 times. His areas of interest include corporate strategy, innovation, competition policy, and intellectual property. Patrick Kilbride is Senior Vice President of the Global Innovation Policy Center, a division of the United States Chamber of Commerce. His focus includes the impact of intellectual property rights on businesses of all sizes, international IP developments, and innovation policy. GIPC addresses issues relating to innovation and creativity by advocating for strong IP standards. Kilbride leads GIPC's policy initiatives to promote IP-driven innovation. Previously, he served in President George W. Bush's administration as Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Intergovernmental Affairs. Good morning, gentlemen. Welcome to Understanding IP Matters. David, you're near San Francisco today, and Patrick, you are in Washington. Welcome. Peter Drucker famously said, "You can't manage what you can't measure." It's not new, but many IP rights, such as patents, are reflected on company balance sheets simply as goodwill. That provides a distorted picture of value and the importance of rights like patents and intellectual capital as well. Why does the U.S. and other nations, why do they still obscure these assets? What's the challenge here? David?
Fundamentally, it is hard to measure them the way accountants like to measure them, but there are ways to measure them. So, for instance, there's well-known Q ratios. If you look at the market value of a company to either its book value or its corrected mark-to-market book value, the two different types of Q, that's a very good indication that the values of companies run, in most cases, well ahead of the value of their physical asset. So we do know that there is enormous value to intangibles, but the problem is that it's nothing that accountants can audit and get their arms around. And so they, I like you, I think I would sooner leave goodwill off the balance sheets altogether rather than represent it the way it is, because it's a misleading guide.
To paraphrase Mr. Drucker just a bit, business leaders always tell us if we can't measure it, we can't improve it. And I always add, if we can't define it, we can't measure it. And, in the sort of narrow legalistic intellectual property space I think most of us have been working in, we've done a pretty good job of defining what a strong intellectual property environment looks like. In fact, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has done that through its International IP Index, where we have 50 discrete indicators in 9 categories that collectively assess and compare the strength of intellectual property protection in different markets. But to David's point, we really haven't done that for in the broader class of intangible assets. And so I think the first step is really to define the space and then identify discrete assets or asset categories that should be counted. And then, when you know what you're trying to measure, you have a much better chance of measuring it.
What about the relationship between intellectual capital and intellectual property? I would think IP, intellectual property, is a subset of intellectual capital. Patrick, how do you see that?
I would agree. I think it's a very small subset. So when we're only looking at IPS, we're talking about a small sliver of the value that our businesses, our governments, individuals have vested in their knowledge-related assets. So in all aspects of society and the economy, we can benefit from helping entities define the assets that they have. And we can talk later about what it means to have an asset, to possess it, versus what it means to legally own it. But either way, you should be able to have tools that enable you to leverage it.
I likewise see intellectual property as just a subset of this broader category of intellectual capital. We have to realize, and this is something the public doesn't understand, that the IP isn't technology itself. It's a set of rights, basically, to exclusive use. And sometimes that aligns with the value of the technology. Sometimes it doesn't, because the rights, are something less than, sometimes more than, but generally less than the underlying asset that is at issue. So there's a lot of confusion. And then, of course, people in Silicon Valley use the word IP in a very loose way, for something more than IP rights. If you got any IP with this, really relates to, do you have any special technology, is sort of the way you can translate it. So there is confusion all over the place with respect to what really IP is all about.
A search for innovation policy doesn't reveal very much. If you Google it, the first item is a fact sheet about the European Union and how they see innovation policy. What's the history of innovation policy in the U.S. or in the world, if you will? And what does it have to do with intellectual property?
You pick up on something quite important. I think if you Googled China, you would get some answers as well. In the United States, we sort of do have an innovation policy. It's not a top-down one. It's sort of a little bit bottom-up. Sadly, it's not prioritized except sporadically, and nor is it aligned. So you got various agencies, NSF, even the Department of Commerce, DARPA, that would claim that they're making significant contributions. On the other hand, you've got various agencies that are very much, even though they wouldn't say so, but they are anti-innovation. Even the Federal Trade Commission, look at its attack on Qualcomm, in my view, was sort of anti-innovation, doing so in the name of innovation, of course. Look at the fact that we managed to, with our antitrust lawyers, to destroy Bell Labs. That was collateral damage. I don't think it was deliberate, but it just shows there's nobody in Washington standing up for innovation. We have a science advisor to the president. We don't have an innovation advisor. We need an innovation czar, in my view, to put their hand across and at least articulate the importance of having a coherent innovation policy. We've done okay. Universities and other aspects, other institutions, and the corporation, of course, have been champions of innovation. The venture capital community has helped bring it to market. They don't do much for the early stage activity. And I fear in many cases that we're eating our seed corn. But I think you do raise an important point. There should be somebody in every government agency championing innovation. It's certainly a much used term, but in terms of policy priority, it doesn't get as much attention as it needs.
It's interesting that less developed nations seem to have a more coherent innovation policy because they feel they need it. They want to go further. Patrick, you have a lot of experience with that. But the U.S., because it's market-based, perhaps more market-based than other economies, it's just like you let the sticks fall where they fall and, innovation will come out of it somehow.
Well, at the Chamber, my department is at the Global Innovation Policy Center, but we didn't always have that title. We started life as the Global Intellectual Property Center, and we made a conscious decision a few years back to rebrand for the specific objective of stepping back and zooming out, trying to understand how intellectual property rights supported innovation. And so that led us to really look carefully at the ecosystem for innovation. And what you see is that knowledge advancement and innovation and technology transfer all proceed along a spectrum right through the life cycle of innovation. And you see lots of different stakeholders involved. You see governments doing very important funding of early stage scientific research that often provides, primes the pump for the private sector, for universities to jump in and take those findings and advance them to do product development and testing, and then the really hard work of commercialization and scale up. And from there, you see, new forms of knowledge, new forms of innovation disseminate throughout an industry, throughout the global economy over time. And that's a dynamic that we really ought to foster. And so when I think about innovation policy, I'm thinking about those set of legal, economic, and policy factors that enable the fluid exchange of ideas and knowledge related assets throughout that ecosystem in order to get more innovation, more legitimate technology transfer, and just continued progress.
Patrick, the U.S. Chamber encourages businesses to rely on rights, IP rights, for economic growth to create jobs. How does IP play a role?
One of the important things that we think about from an investment standpoint, we always think intellectual property should be viewed from the beginning of the innovation equation. If you have a solid foundation of IP rights, a rule of law environment for business where those rights are predictable, transparent, reliable, and reliably enforced, then businesses can make investments on a long time horizon. You see those, resource intensive, high risk investments being made because they know that on the back end, they'll have the associated rights that enable them to commercialize. When you do that, then you can have all these different stakeholders in the ecosystem come to the table and enter partnerships because they have a basic measure of value, vested in that intellectual property right that enables them to agree. Okay, you're bringing this to the partnership, I'm bringing that, we're each agreeing on the value that we're going to place on it, whether we're right or wrong about that value, you're going to agree to it. And that's what enables collaborations and partnerships to go forward.
Yeah, and I think building on what Patrick has said, we should distinguish between value creation and value capture. And I think, all of the various government actions we talked about so forth, particularly on the funding side, are about supporting value creation. But you can't keep creating value in the private sector unless you can also capture value. And that's where IP rights come in. Not the only way, there's first mover advantages, there's use of complementary assets, but it's critically important. And in my view, more and more important as, with globalization, because the speed and thoroughness of imitation has gone up dramatically. People like to say, well, look, the theft of trade secrets has been going on forever. That's how the American textile industry got started, based on the British and so forth. But, someone might have been able to take some notes or memorize the layout of a textile facility. Now you can, on a laptop, get the whole design of a semiconductor fab. So it's been turbocharged by, in my true economics, by a factor of 1,000. The ease of imitation. Creation hasn't gotten any easier, but the ease of theft has gone up dramatically. So in this world we're in, and where America's competitive advantage is in innovation, we really have to pay attention to the value capture side of it, or we've got nothing left. And this, to me, is the biggest thing the public doesn't understand, is that they're getting to learn there's a lot of cyber theft and what have you going on, but they don't understand that our very competitive advantage, which is not in manufacturing, it's in innovation, is at risk if we weaken our IP system and our IP rights. And that's where my colleagues in the economics profession completely have their head in the sand. They're not champions of IP rights as they should be, because they're looking at short-term effects. The whole profession is focused on the here and now. What can we do for the consumer? Not tomorrow, but today. Whereas if we're stewards, we care about the future, then we've got to be focused on doing as much as we can to assist value capture, even if from time to time that creates a little dent in value creation, because the whole global system is now topsy-turvy. And if we don't recognize these transitions that have happened over the last 50 years, then we're not going to get our policies right.
Let's talk about China for a moment. They've come a long way with regard to IP and IP rights. A few decades ago, they had no IP system, and today they have a fairly robust one with courts that appear to follow rule of law. What is still lacking in China to make them a true IP player?
Yes, they've got many of the instruments of IP, and they're very energetic around patenting, but there is not a rule of law approach, in my view, because it's completely non-transparent. Not completely, but it is not transparent whether or not you're going to be able to get any value from your IP rights. There's sort of an implicit understanding that, well, China 2025 and our long-term goals here are way more important. We'll look at everything on a case-by-case basis. If you foreigner contributing to that, there's one thing. If you're not, then we're not going to honor your IP system, or you're going to find other difficulties in protecting your IP rights. So yes, some of the machinery is there, but in my view, it's not transparent and it's not even-handed. I'm sure Patrick has stories to tell in that regard, but I think it's got a long way to go on the things that matter, at least for foreign companies. For Chinese companies, perhaps it's a little easier, but for foreign companies, they have a long way to go.
Patrick, what does China need to be doing more of with regard to IP?
I mean, effectively, what we see is the difference between a rule of law-based free market economy and a political economy. And, as China builds its IP system and builds, rigor and discipline into that, we are seeing many IP rights respected, enforced, much more so in the past. And we've seen that reflected in the Chamber's International IP Index, where over 10 editions, China has steadily rose in both score and rankings. But at the same time, we know that, if you're bringing your IP 100 times and it goes fine 90 times, that the next 10, because the government wants what you've got, that the thumb could be on the scale. And so in the absence of that rule of law environment, all the predictability and reliability that investors need to be able to innovate in that market, or even frankly to deliver their innovation to that market, is thrown into question. And I think we're seeing that reflected in today's economy, where so many companies are pulling back their investments from China and not risking their most valuable IP.
We can't blame China for everything. It appears some U.S. companies, in their zeal to cash in on the huge Chinese market, they've given a lot away, patents, trade secrets, et cetera. Patrick, can you talk a little bit about that?
I think that's a natural, and maybe even to defend the companies a little bit, a necessary thing. Now think about a country of the scale of China and the size of that market, and if you're able to establish a certain scale doing business globally, including in China, versus if you have to pull back from that market and compete against other companies that do, that's one of the competitive aspects that comes into question. That's why it's so important for us to keep working multilaterally to raise IP standards globally, not just to sort of sit back on our laurels and say we want to have a strong system at home, and if China doesn't have a strong system, well, just don't go there. That's not a realistic choice for many companies and many industries.
Lenin is reported to have said that a capitalist will sell you the rope with which you can hang him. And to me, that has some truth to it, that companies where the management team is rewarded by the shareholder value in the time period that they're in the chair, so to speak, can see some short-term benefits in selling technology. And quite frankly, I think there's been naivete coupled with incentives that are not right that have led American companies to be attracted by what Xi Jinping calls the gravitational force of the China market. So you've got the gravitational force of the China market, the short-term shareholder orientation, and it's a toxic combination, and fear that if you don't do it, somebody else will, because we're not able to collude with respect to not transferring technology. That toxic combination means that many companies sell out or have their future essentially taken. They're not being strategic about it. They're being tactical all along and not strategic. And the consequences in the long term is often quite disastrous. That said, there may be ways to do it smarter. And I think Patrick's right that companies are wising up some, but our system, which doesn't allow collusion or anything like that, companies are still going to say, well, if I don't do it, somebody else will, so I might as well.
China's increased its investment in venture capital significantly. I think they represent about 20% of all venture capital investment currently. What does that mean for U.S. and other national innovation? Patrick?
We've used the term rule of law throughout this conversation. I think you can't get away from that. If the fundamental U.S. competitive advantage in the global economy, David said innovation, and I would agree that that's a huge pillar of it. But the other piece and the enabling piece is our capital markets and the liquidity that they drive, helping to liberate and bring to life all of the assets that we as individuals own that in many other countries are locked up because they don't have the security, the confidence to invest those assets into the economy. And so I think why venture capital has worked so well in the United States, why private equity, public equity has worked so well, is because of that rule of law foundation. Intellectual property rights are an essential part of delivering that for the innovation space. And I think for that reason, there's a lot of money floating around China, but they will never succeed in venture capital in the same way that we do without those environmental factors that make the U.S. so successful.
What about some other nations, Patrick, like India? You spent some time in India. What's the world, the IP and intellectual capital world like there?
So it's been interesting to watch India because I think they've been a little schizophrenic prior to, say, 2013, and you go back decades and watch the progression. I think there was a very poor environment for intellectual property protection that has slowly become better, beginning with the WTO agreements. In 2016, there was a national IPR policy. But then at the same time, you see India's support for a waiver of intellectual property rights in the pandemic and really sort of taking a very populist and I would call it a cynical stance there. There's this schizophrenia that continues to manifest itself in the Indian economy, which makes investors and innovators a little leery. But I think the trajectory is overall a positive one. And because of the size of that market, it does become an alternative for companies that want to reach markets on the scale or magnitude of a China, but need a little bit more confidence.
David, you're a well-traveled consultant and investor. What do you see out there in terms of IP potential and development?
Some countries like Germany have sort of taken the lead a little bit, at least in patents, as we've foolishly undermined our own patent system. And you're right, Patrick. I think India is a rule of law country. And while they did spit on IP rights for a long time, I think they're recognizing if India wants to become an alternative to China as a place to partner with or maybe manufacture, and they've got to improve their infrastructure. And their IP laws are part of that. So I'm hopeful that sort of India is trending in the right direction. I think in general, there's a lot of confusion around how IP rights play into economic development and how they play into competition. My view is that IP rights are very important for a good competition policy. And in particular, they power the small to medium-sized organizations against the very large ones. And I find it sort of paradoxical in the U.S. that our competition economists, on the one hand, railing about the bigness and the monopoly power of big tech, and at the same time, they're doing everything they can to undermine IP rights. and the only way a small to medium-sized company can really go up against big companies, not the only way, but they're certainly very much stronger and able to do so if they've got portfolios of IP rights and those IP rights are enforced. So internationally, there's a lot of confusion, and competition policy and competition economists have created a lot of that confusion, in my view.
Patents are supposed to level the playing field. They're sort of the anti-monopoly monopoly, if you will. But are they doing that today in areas like tech?
I would agree with David that our patent system in the United States seems to be under duress, and it's being challenged politically, it's being challenged judicially. That's when I try to step back and say, let's think about what is it that we really want from our intellectual property system. I don't concern myself with how companies get paid. They worry about that themselves. I worry about how they invest. The question that I always start with is, does a patent today enable a company to make a long-term, high-risk, capital-intensive investment? And if not, why not? Is it because key innovations aren't eligible for patent protection? Is it because the risk of post-grant invalidation is high? Is it because there's just simply confusion about how the courts are going to look at different claims and claim structures? And so we need to step back to that first principle of let's promote investment. The rest will follow from there. But I also think, to a certain degree, the legislation that we see pending today is a little bit of shuffling the deck chairs, right? We're trying to make tweaks to what is too small and legalistic a frame of reference for intellectual property. And to sort of take us back to where we started, I think the answer, you've heard sometimes when you have an intractable problem, the answer is to make it bigger. I think we need to look at the question of intellectual property and intellectual capital through a much bigger lens and think about how we enable individuals, firms, and governments today to leverage all of the knowledge-related assets that they have to either bring them into the quote-unquote, legal system of intellectual property rights, or to define other rights and tools that help them to manage those assets. Because today, it's know-how, it's information flows, and it's data that are driving productivity. We can't afford to fall behind that. I think the big competitive advantage of the United States, again, has been being at the leading edge in innovation, because we're also at the leading edge of policy. We haven't yet brought our policy into the 21st century. That almost was the essence of the middle income trap. You saw countries like Chile and Mexico achieve middle income status through implementing more open trade that allowed them to take advantage of their labor and commodities advantages. But then they didn't take the next step to implement the kind of intellectual property rights that would allow them to become knowledge economies and make that leap to higher income status. I think the United States is at a similar impasse today where we've done the intellectual property rights piece, but we need to take the next step to broaden our view of intellectual capital and enable all of those assets to be not just utilized, but leveraged.
Well, Patrick is right. I think we're agreeing on this, that our competitive advantage in the United States depends on intangibles. And we got to be thinking about all the different ways that we can continue to invest and to encourage investment in intangibles and to protect those rights. There's no point in investing in them if you can't protect them. And there's lots of things that go into that. IP rights is part of it. Actually, good management's also part of it. And the United States has indeed been willing to, in the past, the private sector has made big, bold bets. And to make big, bold bets, you have to have secure, not just property rights, but secure claims on profits, too, to the extent to which we don't allow the benefits of investment in R&D to flow through. That's damaging to our economy. The problem is that people sort of take it for granted that we're an innovation economy. We're just going to keep innovating. It can't be taken for granted. It's true that, there's a good deal of government funding goes into it. But while there's government funding that goes into it, there's all kinds of other policies that subtract from our ability to innovate. And that's where, coming back to your earlier question, having some coherence at the top and some deeper commitment and understanding the importance of intellectual capital and intellectual property would, I think, facilitate policy making across the board, as well as facilitate better private decisions. So, of course, that's why you're doing what you're doing, Bruce.
All right.
But
trying.
but we're small voices on a big topic.
Well, some of the biggest IP owners are the least receptive to new intellectual property or new innovation. True or false?
It's not the absolute level of IP ownership. You may be right, but because they've got some other agenda. I mean, the big tech companies have significant IP rights, but they are frequently not friendly to other people's IP rights. So yes, they have a lot, but they don't have a lot relative in a proportional sense to what little tech and big tech and medium tech does. So you have to look at the relative size of their IP portfolios, not their absolute size, to get a better understanding of where their short-term incentives may lie.
Every company today, every major business is an intellectual property company. I like to use the example of a UPS. I mean, how many tens of thousands of trucks and planes and billions of dollars worth of airport and other distribution facilities do they own, physical, tangible assets. But what makes it work, what creates the value that's vested in that company is the know-how to make all of those things work together. So UPS is very much an IP company, and yet you probably won't hear them talking a lot about patents and copyrights and trademarks, right? Similarly, I see the dichotomy in U.S. industry between companies whose intellectual property is out there in the marketplace, in the product that's reaching customers and therefore is vulnerable to reverse engineering or copying. The industries whose intellectual property is more integral to their internal platform and doesn't need to be exposed in the same way. And I think the benefits of disclosure through the patent system have not been strong enough to incentivize them. I hate the word incentive, but I'll use it for now. Incentivize them to disclose and to rely on patents. Instead, they hold them as trade secrets. And I think part of the answer to that is to define more intellectual property, intellectual capital tools that encourage use of a spectrum of IP-related rights, with maybe the most valuable being protected by the patents or the copyrights, but then relying on trade secrets, relying on open source, relying on a host of different tools that are suitable to the different assets.
Patents are a challenge for policymakers. I mean, so are other IP rights. But what about copyrights and trade secrets? We haven't really talked much about them. Should they be included in innovation policy considerations?
Yes. And, trade secrets are very, very important. And as Patrick is saying, companies are relying more and more on them, in part because the patent system is being weakened. Trade secret law is typically state by state, at least in the United States. But I do think that it's important to protect trade secrets. And I think that, the United States has been reasonably robust in that regard.
To just a personal sort of, call it a pet peeve, but I think we need to change the vocabulary of intellectual property. In particular, I just use the word incentive, but I really hate that word, and I hate the use of the word reward, because I think it creates a misperception. And I think about, like, if you bought a car, you would never view getting a title as an incentive or a reward. It's just a recordation of your ownership. And somehow within this intellectual property space, we've accepted this jargon that I just feeds misperception that IP rights are a government-granted monopoly. Because in the same sense, right, when Disney makes a movie, Mulan, for example, copyright, their exclusive right to the use of Mulan is in no way a monopoly on movies. Your ownership of your car is in no way a monopoly on auto industries. What we're doing is granting a very narrow right to a specified solution to a problem, and it's just one solution. There's no one cure for cancer, for instance. And so I think we really need to go back and rejigger the way we talk about intellectual property in order to get better policy outcomes.
My pet peeve probably relates to Patrick's. I'd put it somewhat differently, and that is that we've got to emphasize in our innovation policy value capture as much as value creation. That means a broader set of issues that go beyond IP rights. And we have to take into account that cyber theft is increasing all the time, and that it's harder and harder in a wired and connected world to protect the IP you have. So the government should be doing everything it can through the legal system to make it easier to protect what you've got and not to let it leak out, particularly now that we've got strategic rivals. In a world of globalization where nations are sort of moving in the same direction, you could turn a blind eye to some of this stuff and say, well, we're all in it together and this is going to benefit the global economy. We no longer can. Now it's a bifurcated global economy with, the rule of law on one side and the rule of rulers on the other side. And in the era where we don't have alignment, this requires dramatically different approach to many of the things that business has done for the last 50, 60, 70 years. And it's been slow for executives to cotton onto this, and it's slow for policymakers to cotton onto it. But I think we need to turn the aircraft carrier, and if we don't, it doesn't look good for us.
Thank you, gentlemen. This has been terrific, really enlightening for me, and I'm sure for our listeners. Understanding IP Matters is brought to you by the Center for Intellectual Property Understanding and its subscribers. To hear other episodes, visit understandingip.org. Follow CIPU on Twitter at Center for IP and on LinkedIn. This episode was produced and edited by Nathan Tower and Aaron Devereaux at Nonsensible Productions. Content conveyed on this podcast is for informational purposes only and does not reflect the views of CIPU or its affiliates.